Welcome to the Worcester Regional Research Bureau's forum, Cutting State and Local Budgets. How Sharp Are the Scissors? My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the President and CEO of the Research Bureau. We'd like to express our gratitude to the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences for hosting today's event, and to greet us today is Dennis Lyons, the Vice President for Government and Professional Affairs. Dennis?
Thanks very much, Roberta, and as always, it's a pleasure for us to be part of the Worcester Research Bureau and to host your meetings. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I certainly don't want to delay the program one bit, but I do want to, on behalf of our president, Charles Monahan, greet you. And Charlie would love to be here today, but he's in training for his role next Sunday as the Grand Marshal for the St. Patrick's Day Parade here in Worcester, so he's working on his endurance to make sure he can make that march. On a more serious business note, the college continues to do things here in the city of Worcester. We have a marvelous relationship, obviously, with the city, and it's certainly been a partnership that has been successful. People have been asking about what's going on down at the what was the former Crown Plaza Hotel, and we are in the process of renovating a good portion of that. Maybe by April of this year, we'll be able to bring folks down to see our new physical therapy program, the new laboratory we're building, state-of-the-art, a state-of-the-art physician assistant program. As people don't know, almost 50% of our business nowadays is non-pharmacy, it's health sciences. And our nursing program, you may have heard about our recent agreement with Worcester State and a partnership to graduate more nurses, which is certainly a great need in the healthcare industry. So lots of things are going on. Our future plans in 2012, we will be opening a school of optometry, also on the grounds of the former hotel. We'll be building a new optometry center there, an eyeglass center, and so you'll be able to come to us and have your eyes tested, get your blood pressure tested, get your pharmaceuticals. We'll just be a one-stop, full-service college out here in the city of Worcester. So in any event, it is our pleasure to host the Worcester Regional Research Bureau again today. Most important topic. Have a great meeting. And again, thank you very much, Roberta, for the opportunity. Have a great meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. Today's program, which is part of the Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government, is generously sponsored by Commerce Bank and Bowditch and Dewey. The Research Bureau also wishes to express its appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising today's event, and to the City of Worcester's government channel under the direction of Judy Warren for videotaping it. This event will be rebroadcast on Worcester's government channel 12, as well as on many other local government channels in area towns. Also, be sure to visit our website at www.wrrb.org, where you can read and download Research Bureau reports, as well as announcements of upcoming events and highlights from past events. As many of you know, 2010 marked the 25th anniversary of the Research Bureau, and through the generosity of many sponsors, we were able to bring you an exceptional lineup of events, including 5 nationally recognized speakers and an annual meeting in September at the DCU Center. And I'm very pleased to announce that in 2011, we have once again put together another excellent series of events, beginning with today's program. And the events are all listed on the sheet of paper that was left at your seats. The next event will take place on March 31st at 5 p.m. at Assumption College, where we will honor 3 outstanding municipal employees with the Thomas S. Green Public Service Awards. We've just made those announcements, and the recipients are Ronald Brown from the Worcester Department of Public Works and Parks, Louise Clark from the Worcester Public Schools, and Officer John Mahan, both from the Worcester Public Schools and the Worcester Police Department. On April 13th, we will co-present with Holy Cross a showing of the documentary film Waiting for Superman at the college's Cielos Theater. It'll be at 3 p.m. And the movie will be followed by a panel discussion featuring educators with firsthand experience in urban schools, and you won't want to miss this. On May 11th, you won't want to miss any of them, but this is a particularly moving documentary, and if you haven't seen it, you really should. On May 11th at 7:45 a.m., we will co-present with Harvard's Kennedy School Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston a panel discussion, Public Employee Pensions, Is It Time to Retire the System?, a topic that is currently on the front burner of practically every state and municipality in the nation. Our 26th annual meeting will take place on Tuesday, May 31st at 4 p.m. at the DCU Center, and I'm very pleased to announce that our featured speaker is Senator Scott Brown. After our summer break, we're planning 2 more forums, one addressing transportation, specifically access to Worcester Airport, and in December, an assessment to date of healthcare reform in Massachusetts and the nation. Once again, Commerce Bank will be our presenting sponsor and Bowditch & Dewey our leadership sponsor. We are currently recruiting additional sponsors, and I'd be happy to discuss with anybody these opportunities. Please call or email me. Also returning in 2011 as sponsors to date, we have confirmed Fallon Community Health Plan, Polar Beverages, Unibank, United Bank, Saint-Gobain, People's United Bank, Benefit Development Group, Fallon Clinic, Fletcher Tilton now, excuse me, I was about to say the third, but I'm not supposed to anymore, Protector Group, Verizon, Providence and Worcester Railroad, Webster 5 Cent Savings Bank. And the Worcester Telegram and Gazette is our media sponsor. And thank you all, and I hope that by the next event, this list will be considerably longer. We hope that you mark your calendars with these dates, and as I said, the information sheets are on your seat and also, of course, on our website. It's now my pleasure to begin today's program and to introduce someone who, of course, needs no introduction, David Forsberg. He's the moderator of today's program. David has been the president and chief executive officer of the Worcester Business Development Corporation since 1999, an innovative and leading force in economic development in the central Massachusetts region. Prior to being appointed president of the WBDC, David held a variety of positions over a number of years. He was the chief development officer for Massport, the chief development officer for the city of Worcester, the Secretary of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services for the Commonwealth under then-Governor Weld. And from 1989 to 90, David served as the New England Regional Administrator for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. And last, but certainly not least, David is a member of the Research Bureau Board of Directors. David, thank you.
Thanks, Roberta. I always get a little nervous when people go into that much detail on my CV because it could leave the impression that I can't keep a job. But I am pleased to be safely ensconced at the WVDC and very much enjoying working in Worcester. This is a real treat for me to moderate this panel. My staff pointed out to me yesterday when they found out about this that there's a certain irony involved because I prepared for my professional career at Harvard Divinity School, not Harvard Business School. So the staff is used to seeing me pray over the budget rather than do anything substantive or on point in terms of the exact numbers. But I got a little reassured when I saw the panel because rest assured that we have a group of people here who are very, very prepared to discuss this issue. You notice we're all in serious suits because this is a serious situation. I have not in my public service career remembered a time that is quite this difficult. And the 3 people we're going to hear from are facing significant challenges, and they certainly have the background and the expertise to guide us through this period. We are in good hands at the state level and at the municipal level, and I think that that will be evident. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker, the Secretary of the Executive Office of Administration and Finance, Jay Gonzalez. Prior to that, he served as Undersecretary, and having been a secretary for a couple of years, I can attest to the fact that he has endurance, because it is a tough job to have done for that period of time. When he was Undersecretary, he served with my good friend and former colleague Leslie Kerwin, and everyone was pleased when he succeeded her as secretary. His background goes beyond finance, and anywhere there's a key priority of the governor, you can see the secretary's involvement in this. He has extensive background in transportation, in collective bargaining. He's headed up the governor's efforts in areas involving broadband, housing, and renewable energy. I think you could say, in terms of the Patrick administration agenda, he has been everywhere. Prior to public service, he was a partner at the law firm of Edwards, Angel, Palmer, and Dodge, LLP, where he focused on public finance. So he brings to this assignment a real understanding of the problems facing cities and municipalities all across the Commonwealth. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College and Georgetown University Law School, and resides in Brookline with his wife and 2 daughters. Secretary Gonzalez.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank the college for hosting us and the Research Bureau for putting on this event. They provide an important public service in doing events like this, and the many that Roberta mentioned before, so thank you for having me. I'm also glad to be in Worcester. I don't get here that much, but I have been here a few times. I was telling Alex Zeroulis, my communications director, on the way over, how I remember the last time I was driving around somewhere out there and lost for about an hour, late for one of my visits. But one of the things I love about coming to Worcester is every time I've come, it's clear that there's something happening here. There is a real, tangible, positive civic spirit that I have witnessed and observed in the different forums I've been in Worcester, and it's I think a real statement about this city and about all of you who make that happen. And so it's a pleasure to come and a pleasure to be here. I noticed my colleagues on the panel have PowerPoints, slick PowerPoints and written presentations, and they've set a very high bar, and I have nothing. So I'm just going to talk at you for a little bit, if that's okay, about the state budget and the governor's budget recommendation for fiscal 12. And our fiscal challenges generally, and then a little bit about some of our municipal proposals that we filed with our budget at the end of January. Fiscal 12, which starts on July 1st, is by far our biggest budget challenge that the state has faced. And we're not unique in that regard. Every state across the country, if you've been reading national press, you've been reading about how every state is struggling with some pretty significant challenges. And the common story across the country is the fact that this recession has been so deep that it has devastated state tax revenues with the sharpest declines in history. Including in Massachusetts. At the same time, because of the economy, more and more people need help, and more people are relying on state safety net programs, which increase cost pressures for the state, just as all of our revenues have been falling off a cliff. For next year, it's going to be the first year out of the past 3 that we will no longer be getting federal help to support our budget, which has been a bridge to economic recovery, but not quite a long enough bridge. And all states are facing some pretty significant challenges in terms of healthcare costs, just like all of you in your businesses, families, individuals. the trend in growth in healthcare costs is just unsustainable, and it is a big factor for our state budget and others. And long-term liabilities. Roberta mentioned the fact that states across the country are reassessing their pension plans. The governor has filed his own pension reform proposal. We've got an unfunded liability at the state of $20 billion. All states also have retiree health benefit liabilities, and these are big issues that need to be addressed. So pretty significant fiscal challenges across the board. In that context, as we looked at our fiscal 12 budget and developing the budget as a starting point, we looked at how much we're proposing to spend in this fiscal year, and right off the bat, we have to take out about $1.9 billion as a starting point for and the state budget is about $30 billion. Take out about $1.9 billion as a starting point because that's the amount of one-time resources we're using to support this year's budget that we need to assume as a starting point we don't have for next year. $1.5 billion of that is that federal stimulus money that I was talking about that we will no longer have next year. So $1.9 billion in one time is gone. And so even though the economy is now going the right direction and tax revenues are growing, they're only going to grow by about $740 million. So it only offsets part of that lost one-time revenue, which means our starting point for developing the fiscal 12 budget is a budget that has $1.2 billion less resources than what we have this year as a starting point, and that's with tax revenue growth. It's also important to note that tax revenue growth, that estimate of tax revenues for next year, is still less than what the total tax revenues were in fiscal 08, the governor's first year, and that is with $1 billion more from the sales tax increase from a couple years ago. It just gives you a sense of how different a world we are living in and the new fiscal reality facing the state. The governor's budget proposal has proposed about $620 million of additional resources to help close that $1.2 billion gap. No new taxes, some one-time resources, some other a variety of other proposals. That means that our budget proposal for next year has us spending $570 million less than what we're spending this year, which is the biggest year-to-year drop in state spending in 20 years. It is a significant challenge, and the consequence is we have cuts throughout the state budget, impacting all kinds of programs, some of which are eliminated, impacting, I'm sure you're going to hear, municipal governments in terms of cut to local aid, and impacting people who depend on the state for critical programs and services that they need and expect. And it's unavoidable. There are certain parts of the budget that actually have to go up a bit. I'm going to talk about Chapter 70 education aid to meet the foundation formula. We have to increase spending for Chapter 70. Debt service has to go up a bit. Some other accounts. When you take into account that's about $600 million that needs to be increased for a very small set of accounts. When you take that into account, and we need to offset that and end up with a budget that's $570 million less, it means it's $1.2 billion of cuts across the state, the rest of the state budget. A very significant challenge. And at the same time, we need to ensure that growth in healthcare costs, which, as everybody knows, is a major challenge, that we've got to constrain that growth. And we've got some proposals to do that. So a very challenging budget. Having said that, there are a few highlights from my perspective. One is we have preserved some critical investments. Job creation, one of the governor's top priorities, and economic development. One of his strategies for job creation and economic development is reinvesting in our infrastructure, in our roads and bridges, our higher educational facilities, everything else that the state, all the other infrastructure the state's responsible for. This budget supports a capital investment program that is more than double what the state was investing in capital investments when the governor took office 4 years ago. Used to be the state was spending $1.7 billion on infrastructure investments. We are now in fiscal 12 projecting to spend about $3.6 billion. That is a big priority of this administration. You see it as you drive around. That day I was talking about where I got lost and was an hour late, was going to visit various different projects my staff gave me for my ride on the way over here, the list of projects going on in Worcester, and it goes on and on and on and on. And that is because of these investments that we are continuing to support because they're important for our continued economic growth. The other thing that a lot of business representatives in the room should know as part of this commitment is we are continuing to move forward with the planned reduction in the corporate tax rate, which costs us next fiscal year $185 million in additional revenue, which goes back into the pockets of over 35,000 businesses across the Commonwealth to invest in their businesses, grow their businesses, and hopefully grow jobs. Continued investment in education and closing the achievement gap. Chapter 70 has a historic level of state funding, $140 million increase over last year, about $4 billion total, because we need to continue to invest in education as a major component of our growth strategy. And the governor has put a focus on addressing youth at risk and urban violence issues and continued to invest in those programs and in some cases increase the programs in our state budget that address those issues. So a number of key investments preserved. Controlling healthcare costs. We have a number of proposals in our budget to achieve that result that I mentioned we need to achieve to keep our healthcare costs from growing. They used to be, just over 10 years ago, 21% of our total budget. They're now 40% of our total budget, which means everything else the state does is getting crushed and has been over the last 10 years or so. We need to change that. It's unsustainable. So we've got a number of proposals in our budget with the overriding objective of continuing to provide good quality coverage to all of the citizens who need subsidized health insurance through our Mass Health or our Commonwealth Care Program, and for all of our state employees, doing everything we can to mitigate the impacts on benefits and coverage for them by driving a strategy of trying to drive care to lower cost settings and through some competitive procurement strategies, incent the plans that provide coverage for these populations to find savings. And we think we've got some good proposals on the table that are going to allow us to avoid what would otherwise be $1 billion growth in healthcare costs. The big thing that I think we're doing in this budget proposal, building on the last 4 years, is changing the way government does business. When the recession started, there were a number of people that said it presents an opportunity for change. We are way past the opportunity for change point. The current fiscal situation that I just described demands that we change. We have to do everything possible to stretch every single taxpayer dollar as far as we can, because even when doing so and doing so effectively, we are having to scale back programs and services that are impacting people, and we got to do everything we can to hold as much of that together as possible. We have that responsibility. So in the governor's budget proposal, we have a slew of reform proposals to make government more effective and more efficient. Some are programmatic reforms. One example of that, which you may have heard about or read about, is we're proposing to completely change the way in which we provide free legal services to indigent criminal defendants, going from a system that right now where we contract out 90% of the cases to private attorneys on a billable hour basis and bringing it all in-house. We think we can save the state $60 million a year. That's based on a conservative analysis. It's controversial, but we have to change the way we do things. Operational reforms, we're changing the way in which we operate in government, taking additional steps towards shared services within our agencies, changing the way in which we procure for goods and services to better leverage our purchasing power and save the state money, a whole bunch of reforms to change the way in which we operate. And we're making proposals to make government work better, more accountable, better performance, focusing on moving in the direction which a lot of businesses in this room probably have already gone down the road of, but state government has not yet, but going aggressively in the direction of looking at performance management. What is it we're trying to achieve through all of our different programs? How well are we doing at achieving it? And what changes do we need to make to get the results we're looking to get? And using that information and that approach to better manage in government and to budget in a more informed way, to allocate resources to those places where we're being effective. State government doesn't do that very well right now, and we need to move in that direction. So we've got proposals along those lines. The thing about the budget I'm most proud of is how responsible it is. When Governor Patrick took office in fiscal '07, the fiscal '07 budget he inherited had a structural deficit of close to $2 billion. That means the state was spending against tax revenue that was not sustainable over time by about $2 billion. And that is a problem, and that's a problem that has been difficult to address through the recession. As the recession hit and tax revenues plummeted, we ended up having to fill holes with one-time revenues. $3.2 billion in one-time revenues in fiscal '09 was the high point of the recession. We have, in his budget proposal for fiscal '12, eliminated the state structural deficit, eliminated it. That is a huge accomplishment. At the same time, we're addressing our long-term liabilities through a major pension reform proposal. There have been pension reforms passed in the last few years, which were mostly targeted to dealing with the abuses in the system. This reform proposal is focused on fiscal sustainability of the system, increasing retirement ages, making other changes that are going to reduce costs for the state by over $3 billion over the next 30 years, and for municipalities by $2 billion over the next 30 years. By increasing the retirement age, it also reduces our cost for retiree health benefits going forward by about $1 billion for us and $1 billion for municipalities. So major reforms to address our long-term liabilities, and I'm very optimistic about the prospects of it. The Speaker, the Senate President, the State Treasurer stood with the Governor on the day that he filed the bill in support of it. So I'm very optimistic it's going to pass this year, and that's a big deal. I presented our budget and all the steps we're taking to live within our means and be fiscally responsible and address our long-term liabilities and our trends in healthcare costs to the rating agencies right after we filed the budget proposal. And I'm happy to say that Standard & Poor's, as a result of the steps we're taking, specifically citing our fiscal management, has given us a positive outlook for our bond rating, which means that in the near term we expect it's going to go from AA to AA plus, one notch below the highest possible bond rating. It has been good news through the recession that we've been able to maintain our strong AA bond ratings. The fact that we now, for the first time in years, in the midst of this fiscal crisis, and while lots of other states are seeing their ratings tank, Massachusetts is moving up. That is a very good sign, not only for how we're managing and that we're living within our means, but it means we're going to be able to continue to access the bond market at even lower interest rates, saving taxpayers millions of dollars for us to continue to make these capital investments that I was talking about. And it's important for businesses. Businesses who, many of whom I've sat in the Governor's Council of Economic Advisor meetings and heard some of our top business leaders say, I would not invest in California right now, or Illinois, or New Jersey. Massachusetts is different. Massachusetts has its act together. We've got a fiscally sustainable plan. We've been managing our budget well, and that stability is good for business and hopefully gives businesses the level of comfort they need to know they're in a stable environment and can invest in Massachusetts. I'm going to just very quickly run through some key municipal proposals. We've proposed increasing Chapter 70 funding for education by $140 million. We've proposed increasing Chapter 90 funding for local road and bridge projects by $45 million to $200 million next fiscal year. We have proposed increasing special education funding by $80 million, which has been a real issue for municipalities. We have had to cut unrestricted local aid by $65 million. That's on top of cuts from prior years. It's just something that was unavoidable. Most other local aid accounts have been level funded. We have proposed, and we are in the process of putting together a task force to look at how we allocate local aid going forward. Our current system has been the creation of a lot of ad hoc decisions over time, and it is not based on any rational formula or standards. We need to take a fresh look at it, and once we get back into the position of being able to add money to local aid, think clearly about how we should be allocating that money among our municipalities. The governor's filed a proposal to help municipalities deal with their municipal health insurance costs. The pension reform proposal, as I mentioned, over time will save municipalities significant funding. We're proposing to create a new municipal procurement bureau at the state's procurement shop to work with municipalities to identify things municipalities purchase in common to help them aggregate their purchasing power and save money. We have proposed a new regionalization and efficiency incentive fund funded with $9.7 million to give seed money grants to municipalities on a competitive basis, similar to the Race to the Top program at the federal level, to help fund new innovative ideas for regionalizing to save money or other innovative cost savings ideas. The same thing we need to do at the state in terms of changing the way we do business, we need to do at the municipal level, and we're hoping that this fund incentivizes some creative thinking and new ideas at the municipal level. So a number of different initiatives for municipalities that we're hoping help give them the tools to manage through these difficult times also. So I want to thank you and look forward to whatever questions you have after the slick presentations you're going to get from the municipal guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary, very much. I think I'm closing in on the NCAA record for introducing our next speaker, and it's a pleasure to get to do that frequently. Michael O'Brien has been the city manager for the last 7 years, and I think everyone in this room realizes that he's done an outstanding job during a very, very difficult period. I think he's best known for big ideas, for pushing an aggressive economic development agenda. He has not been afraid to reform. He has not been afraid to reorganize, and he has not been afraid to innovate. He has been a voice of sanity on the whole issue of health benefits and the impact that they're having on the city budget, and has introduced a business model for city practices. The Secretary mentioned the good news on the bond rating. I think one of the manager's remarkable accomplishments is that during this tough time, he's been able to keep the city's bond rating up and healthy. Tom Sedelis will tell you we've come a long way since I blurted out to Moody and Standard & Poor's that we're going to spend our way out of this problem. We're being a little more sophisticated. Prior to being the city manager, I think we all realized that Michael was Commissioner of Parks and Recreation and did an outstanding job in that capacity as well. He is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and like the Secretary, he has a wife and 2 daughters, but he lives in Worcester. City Manager Michael O'Brien.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. I appreciate it. I did want to take a moment, too, especially on a cold day like today, to recognize Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. For their story in Worcester really does warm the heart. the idea of med ed and how we'll revitalize our downtown. Mass College of Pharmacy has put $100 million in the core of our downtown and revitalization efforts to some of our historic grand buildings. But beyond that, they're bringing thousands of students and faculty here to our downtown. First school to cut a pilot agreement with the city, which was amazing. And Dennis details some of the great programming that's taking place here within our city. And a little known secret is also that Charlie donated a personal defibrillator for me, which I get to use occasionally when the news keeps coming in not necessarily favorable. And then one last note, because Charlie Monahan really is a force to be reckoned with, and we really do appreciate all he's done. And I mentioned to Jay as I sat there that Charlie's designation of being the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade is bigger here locally than the Nobel Prize. So we want to congratulate Charlie in his effort. I want to thank the Research Bureau for having this forum. And the title of what I'm going to present is Cures to Cuts and Steps to Long-Term Fiscal Health. So it's a little different than How Sharp Are the Scissors, the Scalpel, the Amputation Tools that the Research Bureau titled the forum. And it's really because I'm an optimist. And so for all of that, I look forward to this presentation as well as the comments. So the reality is our city's fiscal health. Pre-recession, it's important to note. We had real strong vital signs. Pre-recession, we had a 5-point financial plan that we adopted and the council endorsed back in 2006. And this is really about educating and engaging our community in the city budget, what our operations are like, what we do as a city, and establishing priorities, which is so important. And then what I believe is the most critical element of this 5-point financial plan is forecasting, right? What are the challenges? What are the issues? How do we get ahead of these issues and adjust and adapt quickly? It's about living within our means, the 5-point financial plan, adjusting, as I mentioned, managing with a plan and having a direction. And then, of course, what's most important is building reserves, right, for those rainy days and ensure we're doing all the financial mechanisms in the right order to look at the long term. But as I mentioned, adjusting to budget concerns early, addressing prior to crisis, and foregoing the quick fix and focusing on the long term. No more one-time money for ongoing expenses, one time for one time. So it was a new dawn. And signs of defined progress after that 5-point plan was adopted. Literally, when we have free cash, money above expenditures when we close a fiscal year, we're putting those towards 50% of that towards reserves. The past would have seen literally a spending frenzy where that extra money was available at the end of the fiscal year. We'd be putting that money, one-time money, towards recurring costs. It doesn't happen anymore. We were able to fund key capital projects, great projects like North High, which is nearing completion, were able to be undertaken because we put these strong financial structures in place. The city's reserves are rebuilding, which is so important, and our bond ratings, as David had mentioned, have stabilized and improved. And we took on key reforms, and this is important. We did negotiate with our unions, and we were able to get them to take on more of their health care costs. When I came on as city manager, they were paying only 10% of their premiums, and were paying $3 copays at the doctor. We got them to go to 20% to their premium costs, picking up those costs, as well as taking on reasonable copay increases. And then we adopted Section 18, literally a very difficult vote by City Council, and upon my recommendation, was to transition our retirees to Medicare. That's a reform now is being proposed as part of the governor's reforms. But we took that on and literally moved 400 retirees to where 4,000 were. We had 400 retirees on our conventional plans. And now they have access to quality health care, but it's saved about $5 million annually. To date, about $15 million that we've been able to redirect to services. So with that work that we had done, managing government like business, we stabilized municipal services, which was so important. And we then obviously continued on our economic development push. So if you go to the next slide and your handout, from a recession standpoint, what were some of the fiscal symptoms and some of the impacts that we endured, like we've all endured here in our city? With the global meltdown of the economy, what I'll classify in kind of medical terms, code red. From fiscal year 8 to now. City revenues, it's important to note we've only got 4 sources of revenues and they're non-diversified. And so those revenues plummet. State aid declines, had to, because as Jay mentioned, revenues declined at the state level. We had mid-year cuts to state aid in fiscal year 2008. Those are devastating when they happen in the mid-year. We had cuts in state aid in fiscal year 09, fiscal year 10, and fiscal year 11, and projected for 12. It's now a loss of some $22 million of those four sources of revenue, a loss of some $22 million annually. New construction, this is new economic growth in our community, continued to decline. Going back to fiscal year 06, a kind of a high water benchmark, some $4.7 million that we were looking at new revenue growth for the city in new construction. And that drops down to $3.2 million in fiscal year 11, the year that we're currently in. And then motor vehicle excise taxes, one of those other categories of revenue we depend on. Fiscal year 06, we're collecting some $12.5 million. And fiscal year 11, we're down to some $10.5 million. So you can see the steady revenue decline from the four categories that we depend on. Now, real estate tax revenues have remained stable, and I attribute that to the fact that I do a novena every day. And so we're lucky in that category. But with dramatic revenue declines, I will tell you that there were nimble changes. And if you go to the next slide, and I call this kind of the lifeline, where we see the unrestricted local aid. That's local aid used by municipalities, literally reduced over 40% since fiscal year 08. So you can see there in the red the rapid decline in local aid, and I'll get that chart up. You can see that in the red up there. One of four sources of revenues, some $22 million exercised from our budget in a relatively short period of time. Recognize it had to be done, understanding that the Commonwealth had their own revenue challenges, but you can see what it does to four cities and towns. Certainly, I know we'll be talking about that when Norton presents, but it was something we had to adapt to quick. So again, from the recession standpoint, fiscal triage. On the next slide, we stabilize. We manage for that 5-point financial plan, right? When you're in crisis, you buckle down and you begin to work from that plan and look very carefully at what your organization is. On the city side, we had to do what everybody had to do: prioritize, reform, reduce our organization, restructure, realign, and preserve core services, and all done professionally. And I obviously say that with great pride. We had layoffs. Literally, whenever there was a vacant position, we have a hiring freeze underway. On a case-by-case basis, I'm refilling those positions. And then we also work with the Commonwealth and our legislature on an early retirement program. So all in all, when you look at that, we lost some 225 positions in 3 fiscal years, 15% of our workforce eliminated. Deep cuts. Worcester Police Department, they're down 60-plus officers. Worcester Fire Department, likewise. Department of Public Works, even more. And all departments had to restructure. I know Dr. McGee's in the back of the room, our new Commissioner of Public Health. Public Health got decimated. And I had to make these tough decisions working with council and the community. But everybody rose to the challenge. And really, again, I say it with a measure of pride because of the type of folks that work for us. We've been able to stabilize municipal services and carry on. Again, working with our unions, signed zeros for fiscal year 09. And even a few unions that went 2 years and went to fiscal year 10 and took a signed zero in wage increases, and took on employee health care costs with most of the city side unions, where they went to 25% contribution rates for their health care, as well as co-pays that begin to align better with what the private sector is doing. $10 for an office visit, $20 for a specialty visit, $75 for an ER visit, $150 for an outpatient service, $250 for inpatient surgeries, capped at $1,000 per family. A little more reasonable taking on those costs, and it saves real dollars, redirects those to core services. We also did some innovative things. We cut out the middleman on prescription drugs for our employees. We do that directly now, and that saved some $2 million that we redirected to core services. Saved $3 million on the school side. This is all city side I'm describing to you. We transferred the airport to Massport. We purchased our streetlights from National Grid, and we maintain those streetlights. And respectively, that redirected $2 million for the airport and $3 million from the purchase of those lights from National Grid, and put those right back to city services. And in the spirit of the season, truth be told, I did a wee bit of a jig when I handed those keys of the airport over to Massport. And then this just shows you that the type of discipline from city council and the city administration. We get these airport proceeds, and great thanks to the Commonwealth, to Jay, and to Lieutenant Governor and Governor, which set the stage for that transfer of the airport. When we get these proceeds, some $17 million of proceeds from the airport, we put $2 million aside, cash, in this year's fiscal budget for an emergency. We didn't know if that was going to be mid-year state cuts or whatnot, but that just shows you the 5-point plan in action. When $2 million could have put services back, we put money aside to ensure that we were preparing for what could be the worst. And great tribute again to the discipline of City Council working with me to have that money aside. And that money gets put to work. I'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about fiscal triage. So the next slide, fiscal vital signs for 2012. The troubling fiscal health trends continue. Right, as Jay mentioned, the governor's budget, $2.7 million of additional unrestricted local aid that city-side resources used for city-side services is going to get cut again. I talked about it earlier, some $22 million being exercised from our budget and revenue. Fixed costs continue to devour all new city-side revenues, particularly employee and retiree health care. So if we're getting $10 million net new revenue for next fiscal year, you've got $10 million of healthcare cost increases that vaporize that right off the bat. And then as we are, because there's structured formulas for education, which I'm a tremendous supporter of public education here, another $1.5 million obligatory has to go to our Worcester Public Schools based on our revenue formulas through the state education formula. So fiscal vitals for 2012, what are the cures to cuts, right? What can we do to avoid deeper cuts? And what are the steps we should be taking to long-term fiscal health? So in layman's terms, how do we balance our budget? How do we preserve core municipal services? How do we meet community expectations? Because those are high as ever. Their tax bills are going up and they expect those services. And how do we grow our city's economic base, as Jay touched on? What are the key things that create jobs? And then in the end, on this medical theme, is there a doctor? Is there a doctor in the house? So on to the next slide, some diagnostics on our workforce. At Cityside, we are a service organization, as you'd expect. 85% of our municipal budget is wages and benefits. And so when you look at this diagnostic, this chart up here, you can see when I come on in fiscal year 04 as city manager, obviously proud to have served the city 10 years prior to that, we're about 1,650 employees. You can see the steep job loss trend since then relative to the economy. We're looking at efficiencies. We're trying to adjust and adapt our organization to do more with less. And then the recession hits in 08. You can see that start of the decline. We're now just a little over 1,400 employees. And that dotted line to fiscal year 12, I'll get into a little more detail, the realities of additional job losses that could be as a result of where we are from the recession as well as our revenues and expenditures. And there's a limit to what we can overcome with efficiencies, professional management, and technology when you're a service organization, when people expect boots on the street doing the jobs that they are paying for through their tax dollars. Another diagnostic, revenues available for core municipal services. They're in dramatic decline, and this goes to education costs and it goes to fixed costs. And you can see if you look at that next slide, and your handouts are up on, it may be hard to read on the screen, and just look at that line at the bottom of the chart. It says balance for city departments. What you see is the realities of education costs increasing and fixed costs increasing, and what it does to dollars available for just core municipal services, police, fire, the Department of Public Works, public health, economic development, and beyond. It's on a steady decline. Literally over 3 fiscal years, now going into 5 fiscal years, you're seeing a city-side cycle of attrition, layoffs, cuts, and service reductions as our available dollars are being consumed by skyrocketing fixed costs. And those skyrocketing fixed costs are being driven by employee and retiree health care and pension costs. They include in that line item as well debt service and reserve deposits per the 5-point financial plan, but they're a small component of that. Well, the good news is, and this goes to Jay's point, is that funding for education continues to increase annually, and amount shown include some of those state fiscal stabilization funds. This just gives you this next diagnostic and the title, the change in revenues from fiscal year 8 to fiscal year 12 when it comes to municipal services. You see that bar in the middle, municipal fixed cost, 19% increase over that same period. Education, 12% increase in available revenues for education. And municipal services, what people count on day in and day out for what we do, keeping our quality of life and our community safe and prospering, 14% decline over that same period. Again, another diagnostic. This is just state aid for education over that period. It increases some 50% over actually fiscal year 2000 through fiscal year 12. You can see the nature of education funding driven by priority at the state level, certainly at a local level. So as per the title, when we look at fiscal year 2012 on the next slide is, Doc, give it to me straight. I can take it. Where are we at as a community for fiscal year 2012? Let's do the bad news first. Per the 5-point financial plan, again, managing with a plan, our deficit forecast for fiscal year 12, and we did this back last November, and at times you're using the best you can with a cracked crystal ball to determine what these revenues and expenditures will look like with educated guesses and research. We projected a $13.7 million deficit back in November. With the governor's budget that came out, and we're relying on that right now. The legislature hasn't taken up the budget quite yet. And that was the governor's budget came out in January. We had to adjust that based on what we saw for local aid reductions from a $13.7 million deficit to a $14.3 million deficit. Now some good news. As we update for our 5-point financial plan, as we forecast, we look at revenues and expenditures for the fiscal year 12, and we did this update in February. It shows promise, right? And then beyond that, we can make some business decisions now to provide some relief on that debt, on that deficit. First off, we negotiate with hand-to-hand combat with our healthcare providers for our employee and retiree healthcare. And so we begin to negotiate premiums. And the premiums that we're looking at right now for increases for next year are far less than we had projected. We were projecting about 13% increases for next year in premium costs. We believe those are coming below double digit, which is important. We had anticipated that because federal health care changes are now requiring us to keep dependents on to age 26. And that was something we had worked to actually get dependents off our health care. So better negotiations and better premium expectation costs for next year. Revenues have plateaued. This is good economic news. Rather than the steady declines we're seeing some positive trends in revenues and even some slight incremental growth, particularly in new construction. So that new real estate that gets constructed and results in new revenue, real estate revenue, and motor vehicle excise as well. Motor vehicle excise taxes have stabilized and are showing some minor increases. And this is important too. This goes back to that $2 million we set aside in this fiscal year for emergencies. We were planning on carrying over a snow deficit. I mean, when you get 70 inches of snow in about 3 days, which we seem to have had this winter, it blew our snow removal budget. But we had $2 million set aside for an emergency. That certainly qualifies for emergencies. So between what we annually budget, about 3, plus that 2 and some creative work that we'll do to close our budget this year, we won't have to carry over our deficit to next year and therefore save some $1.1 million for next year. And that all goes towards those 3 pieces. Go towards saving and generating about $4.3 million toward that projected deficit. And then some tough business decisions, right? I've got vacancies in our budget. Now, when you plug those vacancies, you end up providing less services, and it has an effect on the budget. But there's going to be some 20 vacancies I'm not going to fill all of next year. That saves $1 million. And then I did have wages built in for next year, some 2% for our employees in that projection. And I have to make the tough decision to say, does it make sense to build wages in and lay off deeper? And I've eliminated those wages in our budget projection for next year. And so that's going to be 3 years of zeros for our employees if that were to materialize. And when you do all that, you end up with an adjusted deficit of some $7 million for what we have to solve for 2012. So to the next slide, radical reductions. How do you address that $7 million? And this is really the last resort. It's cutting 150 additional positions out of the city budget. And you saw the previous chart of what our organization looks like in the beginning. So it reduced our organization to an all-time low of 1,300 employees. And there's no way you can do the math any other fashion. It's less with less. We're a service organization, 85% of us being wages and benefits. So when you cut 150 people, it means we're going to provide less services to our community. Likely service reductions, again, this is all about projections at this point as we build our budget recommendation. But for the WPD, Worcester Police Department's done a fantastic job in this world of restructuring and rethinking their mission. Community policing, extremely successful in this idea of split force, as well as what they do with data and statistics and putting resources out there to address crime as they see upticks. We go back to a strictly 911 call for service organization. These impact units where we put officers out at the peak times of crime in our community with a show of force and great skill out there, gone. Fire, additional closure of fire companies and stations. We've already closed 2 stations and eliminated 2 fire companies, and our community remains safe. We're going to go deeper in this. That means we're not going to meet national fire protection standards. It's going to be longer response times. These are facts. This isn't about being inflammatory or trying to put fear and apprehension out in the community, you're a service organization, you cut bodies, you got to make tough business decisions. Public Works, Bobby Mullen's quote, we're one crisis away from failure. The reality is you got fewer people in the Department of Public Works, and they've taken a disproportionate share of cuts. We're going to have a reduction in basic services and basic functions, snow removal. And the reality is what we endured this year. When you don't have that second and third team to go out there in extended storms, the community struggles, right? Curbside pickup. People enjoy that service. It's partially subsidized by the pay-as-you-throw program. Could be affected in ways that make us pick up trash every 2 weeks instead of every week. These are the kind of things we're going to have to look at. Community expectations would need to be adjusted to new lows in service levels. And the tax bills are going up, so the taxpayer looks at it and says, my bill's gone up, but service levels are going down. So they have a hard time reconciling that. To the next slide, what could we look like when we're done with those 150 positions? 45 fewer police officers. So a total reduction since 08, 100 fewer police officers on our street, another 45 firefighters, so over 100 firefighters reduced over this period. 35 fewer Department of Public Works professionals, and I've told you, they've taken a disproportionate share of cuts to date. Got people like Commissioner Moylan and his team thinking outside the box, still maintaining those services, but there's a limit to what can be done. 25 fewer administration from top to right to line employees. Total reduction since 08, about 75 in administration. And that doesn't include all these frozen positions that I'm not filling. It just gives you some perspective of what we're faced with. And I've got to submit a budget for fiscal year 12 by April. And that budget recommendation is an open book. It's transparent. It's all per the 5-point financial plan. So let's get into what the best medicine is here versus what that looks like. And it's about long-term structural fixes. And I think Jay touched on this a few times in some of the governor's efforts. We all must recognize that the economy is in reset mode. And this is a global economy that's in reset mode. And again, if I use my crack crystal ball, we're in a decade of reset. From the robust revenues and what we saw in the 2000s, it's not happening anytime soon. And I'm an optimist. It's just about adjusting and adapting. We must adapt in ways that recognize these realities, as well as that we have to take on the means that are sustainable over the long term, not the short-term stopgap stuff. 10 years is not short-term stopgap if we're going to pull ourselves out of this. We got to address skyrocketing fixed costs, employee retiree health care, pensions, etc. These are the ones that are eroding our ability to provide the basics of services. And it's clear, if we leave these trends unchecked, what's left? What are we left with as a community? And then you go to some of the recent reports that have been out there by the mass taxpayers. Unfunded retiree health care and pension liability for Worcester is $1 billion. And that's a real bill, folks. That means we're going to have to start looking at that. And how do we apportion that in this range of what's available for services when you have to start allocating money annually towards $1 billion of pension liability and retiree health liability? What's left then? And I say this because people talk about collective bargaining and collective. We have a collective responsibility to address what we're talking about. So cures to cuts for fiscal year 12. Thoughtful, sustainable reforms to our provision of employee and retiree health care. It's achievable in fiscal year 12. A 7-year effort that I've been involved in to get our employees at 25% of their contribution rate in reasonable co-pays that I mentioned earlier. 7 years it's taken, and we still have unions that have not gone to that reform. And I know those in the private sector out here would say, what are you talking about? Those reforms? We pay far more for our health care in the private sector as employees than what you've described. But it's taken 7 years. Now, the world has changed rapidly around us in those 7 years, obviously. And we've adjusted to those rapid increases in healthcare costs and trying to sustain our organization with addressing healthcare costs as part of that component. And I say this tongue-in-cheek, but we've adjusted glacially as to what's happened around us. And so what we all know in this room, all my healthcare realities in city government are subject to collective bargaining. Providers, we have 2 providers named in our collective bargaining contracts. Contribution rates, I have to negotiate that with all the unions. Co-pays and deductibles, all negotiated with all of our unions. And when it comes to healthcare, we know that we have to be able to adjust and adapt each year. You can't wait 7 years. Because you see the trends, what happens. We have to adjust year to year with balance and fairness so that our employees have ease of access to quality health care, which is so important. But we also have to control expenses and preserve services and recognize, too, the taxpayers picking up this bill. As Jay mentioned, the Commonwealth and Beacon Hill are recognizing that we need to assist cities and towns in this endeavor. So what form will it take in fiscal year 12? So cures to cuts are the three methods of healthcare reform that they're looking at right now. All three of these, although there's different nuances to each, would save the city $4 to $6 million. That's the city side. $4 to $6 million if we put this reasonable reform in place. It saves $6 to $8 million on the Worcester Public Schools side. And right now, the Worcester Public Schools are staring at somewhere between a $6 and $8 million deficit on their side. So there's three options, right? The first option is that we work at a local level, local solutions, working with our unions, and together we craft a solution that mirrors the state group insurance plans. And year to year, we work on that, so it's ingrained in our contracts that I can make those adaptations and changes so that we mirror what the state uses for their health insurance plans. And I'll go into some detail what the GIC looks like. The governor's plan, which is on employee health care, requires cities and towns and their unions and employees to develop GIC-like, Group Insurance Commission-like changes to be benchmarked against the GIC. So similar to what I had in option one. And you have to get to agreement with your unions within a defined period of time and a date certain. And if we don't do that, what the governor's legislation calls out for, that it would require us to move our entire block of subscribers, which I think is about 8,000, over to the GIC between employees and retirees, city side, school side, over to the GIC, Group Insurance Commission. Again, that saves us $4 to $6 million on the city side, 6 to 8 on the school side. And then there's a Mass Municipal Association bill that's before the legislature that gives us the same authority that the state enjoys to manage their health care plans with their employees, that we can modify plan design, so copays and deductibles, on a year-to-year basis when we see fit as an administration. And that's the same that the Commonwealth enjoys within the GIC. So on to the next slide. So cures to cuts, specifications on healthcare reform and methods. Option 1 and 2, the two I described. So option 2 being the governor's bill, so both are GIC-like. We retain local authority over our options for healthcare. We benchmark against the GIC, so we begin to align those copays and deductibles to what the marketplace defines. We introduce things like tiered copayments, which helps, right? It's consumer-driven decisions to higher quality, lower cost physicians and hospitals. That reduces our costs, both on the employee side and on the city side. And it would likely require the replacement of Blue Cross and Blue Choice plans with a lower cost Blue Cross, Blue Choice alternative or an alternative provider plan. But allows for creative alternatives such as building a local network. We're working right now with our insurance advisory committee with our employees, trying to look at how we could use our local hospitals, our local physicians in ways that define that as a separate network and where we guide most of our employee activity to. And this is good. It's lower premiums for both savings for the employees and the city. On option 2, as I mentioned earlier, the governor's bill, if we couldn't get to this type of work with our employees, we'd move to the GIC. The other option is just moving to the state GIC. The state manages their own group insurance plans. It's their providers, their plans. I want to say there's some 50 plus providers that are involved in there, no Blue Cross in that. The city is no longer administering health insurance plans. The GIC makes unilateral changes to those plan designs at their convenience when it makes sense, to copays, deductibles, plans, et cetera. They even do it mid-year. In fiscal year 10, they added deductibles, $250 for an individual and $750 for a family, and did that to save money and balance the budgets while still providing their employees access to quality health care. In the GIC, the deductibles, there's higher copays, and they also have the tiered copays. There are lower premiums up front. We don't know what the state's risk pool is, so there's some question marks there. And then going into option 3 that I described, the MMA bill, cities and towns will be granted the same authorities that the state enjoys within their GIC. This next slide is pretty compelling. So $4 to $6 million can be saved on the city side if we looked at any 3 of these options, and then $6 to $8 million on the school side we project if any of these options. But this just gives you some perspective. I talked about what we have now, right? An office visit, $10. A specialty office visit, $20. $250 for inpatient hospital, $150 for outpatient, $75 for ER, and $10, $20, $35 for prescription drugs. Then you look at the GIC options. There'd be the deductibles of $250 for individuals, $750 for a family. Doctor's office visit of $20. Specialty office visit tiered, $20, $35, and $45. Retail clinics, which are important in this mix, $20 visit. We don't have that currently in our structure. $257.50 for inpatient hospital. On the GIC plans, outpatient surgery, $150, so our line's pretty close to what we have. But when you look at this, it's infinitely reasonable, right? This is what everybody else in our world is paying these days for access to medical care. And just for these changes, which seem reasonable, we can get to the types of savings that could prevent cuts, prevent deeper service reductions, and the like. So what's the prognosis and next steps to long-term fiscal health? What I've given you is reasonable and realistic solutions. Healthcare changes are a structural fix and a long-term budget fix. That's what we have to talk about, not that one-time, knee-jerk, make it happen, make it go away stuff, but what do we do to make sure our city's stable over the long term? It preserves jobs, it preserves services, and quality of life. And it still gives our employees tremendous access to quality health care at affordable prices. The layoff option is the option of last resort, but it's a necessary option that I have to exercise if we can't get to some reasonable reform soon. Because I have to begin the layoff process concurrent with my budget submission in April of 2011. Impact bargaining is required with layoffs. We have to structure those layoffs so that they concur. They're concurrent with what would be July 1st, that these people are literally off the books, as bizarre as it sounds, and how impersonal that sounds, because I value their services so much. But I've got to have them off the books for July 1st so we can have a balanced budget for 2012, sorry. It's a law of diminishing returns, as I talk about. This cycle will continue year in and year out without structural fixes, year in and year out. Look at that chart, 1,300. If we effect these cuts of another 150, what will next year, 2013, look like? Or the year after that, 1,000 employees, 900 employees? What are we providing for services? And then the last slide. What do we do? What are the next steps in long-term fiscal health? Obviously, I'm going to participate actively in the legislative solutions that are underway on these potential health care changes and look to secure changes in law. I mean, there's obviously 3 ways to accomplish this. I prefer the local option, but we're clearly going to continue to pursue what could be changes in law and how our health care is managed as a city. We're going to continue to push our economic development agenda, right? The Gateway Cities Initiative, between what we're trying to do with healthcare as well as what we're looking at with Gateway Cities, it's having the Commonwealth give us the tools to help us help ourselves and create economic development in these gateway cities across the Commonwealth, where we've got these historic buildings, we've got a tremendously talented workforce, we've got some brownfields issues, special incentives for our cities to help create that economic growth. We've always been centers of excellence in entrepreneurship and innovation. Help our cities, help ourselves, and look for that tax base expansion. And I don't need to go through all the projects that are underway, but we're making tremendous progress right now, and it's a measure of pride for all of us that we continue to see that kind of expansion despite the economy. We'll further refine and enhance municipal services. You'll count on that. We'll find ways of doing things, creative ways of doing things in spite of these economic realities. And to the Secretary's point, we're pushing regionalism. 911 calls for service. We're regionalizing that. We're regionalizing public health. We're regionalizing veteran services, as well as cultural services and homelessness and beyond. So we're taking that lead. And Jay, I know that $9.7 million you mentioned that's in the budget is probably all for Worcester, so we appreciate that. And then you got to look out over the horizon, and Jay mentioned this as well. Pension and other post-employment benefits, retiree health care, $1 billion of liability there. That's the next frontier. It's a new frontier. We got to keep that in front of us. Long-term structural fixes. And then the last thing is strategic investments. We're investing per our 5-point plan in unprecedented ways in streets and sidewalks, in public schools, public infrastructure, with the support of the Commonwealth to actually make sure we're setting up well for when that economy does improve. And we want to be part of that. We want to continue to have our city be the only place where people want to invest. I remain optimistic. We are making great things happen in our community, and we're doing it together. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. The city manager is the only person I know who could manage to get novena and hand-to-hand combat into the same presentation. And it strikes me that we might need just the right combination of prayer and warfare to get through this. Our next speaker has had a long, distinguished, and very diverse public service career. And during that entire period, he has been a good friend and a neighbor to Worcester. Jim Purcell is the town manager in the city of Norton, in the town of Norton. I was giving you a promotion, Jim, or more problems. And Jim has done an outstanding job there. He is known for a very sophisticated approach to the budget. He is very adept at collective bargaining strategies and is generally credited with doing a great job protecting the financial health of the town of Norton. Like the manager, he has not been afraid to innovate and in some cases consolidate and even abolish agencies and create new ones to take on new challenges of this current time. Prior to that, Jim was the town administrator of Leicester, our neighbor, and very, very active in the Airport Commission, which negotiated the relations between the town of Leicester and the city of Worcester. And prior to that, perhaps his most complicated job, Worcester County manager, back in the days of county government when Jim oversaw facilities that included a 122-bed chronic care hospital, an 800-bed jail, 9 courthouses, and a whole host of other activities that added up to a $42 million budget. So he's had a lot of experience in the arena. He is also a graduate of the University of Massachusetts, and we're pleased to welcome Jim to Worcester today for our final presentation.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back home, born and raised in Worcester, and I've only been away 8 years, but again, I'm very grateful that Roberta asked me to be here. When I asked her, "What are your expectations? What do you want me to do?" She told me the name of the program, and sent me the tape of last year's program. So I knew that I'd be the last speaker. I was afraid that everyone would be looking at their watches, by the time I got here to get back to their offices. But one thing that I noticed from that viewing was that the audience, there weren't a lot of public officials in the audience, and I wondered if folks really understood the process, the process of municipal budgeting. And I knew that the heavy hitters would take care of the macro issues, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about approach and how things really work on the local level. Do you have your handouts? Okay. In the first inside page of the handout is something that is a form that is part of the Norton budgeting culture. It is our operating budget control sheet. This is actually the second of what would be about 15 different changes as we go through the budget process. Now, the budget process begins in earnest in January. We pray for early local aid numbers, never really get them, and local aid is about 30% of the town's total budget. But let's walk through this control sheet. In operating revenues, there are 3 categories of revenue that constitute about 97% of our total take. One is a property tax levy, and the property tax levy for fiscal 12, the base levy number, if you look in the third column, $26,547,773. That is the amount of money that the beginning number for property taxation. The increment of $663,000, it's Prop 2.5. $663,000 is 2.5% of that beginning base levy number. And then new growth. We're always very conservative in our first few passes on new growth. What's new growth? It is the net tax value of all new real estate that comes on the books in a given year. So if you've got a vacant piece of property that we're getting $100 in taxes on, you put a house on it, okay? The value added on the house becomes part of this new growth number. We're pretty optimistic about this number growing over the course of the spring, but in particular in the fall, when we come together again for a town meeting to do certain reconciliations of these estimates. We convert it to reality and we set our tax rate accordingly. So 58% of our total operating expenses would be from property tax levy. That's how it works. Now, there would be additional lines here if the town of Norton, which is very conservative, had ever had a debt exclusion. A debt exclusion is a temporary exception to the Prop 2.5 rule. Typically, schools are school construction. You might see another line. You might have a 20-year note, let's say. That debt service is carried in addition to the base levy, and when the note expires, it too expires with it. The next major category is $30 million for school building assistance. I'm sorry, for local aid. One of our troubles with local aid is really getting a number, period. Okay, you've heard the macro stuff, but the legislative process takes an awful long time, and it goes beyond the municipal fiscal calendar. The governor has to propose a local aid number, as he has. The House of Representatives does that in April. The Senate does it much later, and in the end, they have competing versions. And who you're going to believe. So right now we're dealing with the governor's estimate of $14.3 million, which is about $260,000 less than the current fiscal year. Could have been a lot worse. Okay, it might get that way, but could have been a lot worse. There are a couple local aid sheets. You've heard the term cherry sheet. It's an old-fashioned term. Your local aid estimates come on 2 pages. One, the revenue sheet is green, and the charges, which are offsets to that gross revenue, used to come on cherry-colored paper. So when you hear the term cherry sheet in local aid, you understand a little bit about that. The next major category of aid are estimated local receipts. That approximates 9% of our total revenue, and there's a profile. There's a 3-year profile there, together with projections for fiscal 12 going forward. I've highlighted the bottom lines, and you can see that there had been a steady decrease in those categories. Automobile excise taxes, took a significant plunge from fiscal 08 to fiscal 09. And investment income, what we earn on our cash flow. It's a sign of the times. Interest rates are really very low, and there was a time that we used to make over $500,000 a year. Just investing our cash flow over the course of the year. But for the first time in 4 budget cycles, we're actually estimating increases in our local receipts. Our year-to-date collections for fiscal 11 in 4 or 5 categories by January exceeded all of last year's income. And in particular, construction activities, commercial and industrial construction activities are in a rapid ascent in the Norton area. So we expect an upward adjustment in estimated local receipts as well. So back to the control sheet, if you will. With those 3 categories discussed, we're looking at income of about $47.1 million. One of the holes there is school building assistance of $1,278,000 plus dollars. That income won't be there for fiscal 12, but that really isn't bad news. It's actually good news. We've struck a deal with the State Treasurer's Office to pay off a school construction loan 8 years early, a result of state refinancing of their own notes. And that $1,278,000 represents the state's share of the costs of that school construction. So you'll see how that plays out afterwards. So in Norton, we have it's part of the budget culture now. We estimate our revenues. There are certain expenses that come off the top. We work on fixed and shared expenses. We bundle certain operating expenses, and I'll describe that. And after our regional school obligations, we divide what remains on a 70-30 basis between the schools and the general government. School gets 70%, no matter what the take is. The school gets 70%, the general government gets 30%. When I went to Norton in 2003, that had been the trend for the past 3 to 5 years or so. And as things began to get tough, we said, okay, no one is going to lose their respective share of resources. And that model has really kept the schools and general government, from trying to devour one another during the budget season. Our fixed and shared expenses. The last page of the handout gives you a profile of that. These are budget items that are used in support of both schools and general government. Predictably, debt is there. Employee benefits, big caveat here, folks. Unemployment expenses and miscellaneous expenses. Miscellaneous expenses are your other lines of primarily your other lines of insurance, workers' comp, auto, property liability, etc. And interestingly, in the state's budgetary format, in that miscellaneous category is gasoline. So we work very hard because of the timing of information being slow from the state on local aid. And remember, 30% of our number is local aid. In the beginning portions of the budget process, we work on fixed and shared expenses. And I was at St. Peter's High School, taught by the Sisters of St. Joseph, and they talk often about repetition brings facility. So we keep pounding away in the springtime on these fixed and shared expenses. It does a couple of things. It demonstrates to the public that we are serious about cost containment in this area, that we're fairly sophisticated about it, and it gives the school constituencies in town, a sense that no one's hiding anything, and the 70% that we get, whatever that number is fair. So, in the debt, in managing debt, like most cities and towns, we have financial consultants. We were fortunate enough to do this debt refinancing of the middle school. The state treasury is refinancing. From time to time, they refinance old notes, just like we do with our home mortgages and in the like. We look every year for places to refinance, but most often we find that the bond fees and everything else really don't make sense for us. But this year, some significant opportunities presented themselves. The combined obligations of the town and the School Building Assistance Bureau for the repayment of the school note was $10.4 million. The Commonwealth in town struck a deal where the Commonwealth sent us $9.4 million. We're paying the middle school note off for $8.7 on April 1st, and we'll realize a windfall of more than $700,000, and more significantly, our share of that financing, of that debt financing, won't be on the books for fiscal 12. We were able to refinance another couple of notes for much more modest gains. That made it easy for us to accommodate new capital programs, and in a couple of cases, debt that was authorized but hasn't been issued yet. So it's made room for us to continue our capital program, which we've been pretty aggressive about, even in difficult times. It's important our capital investments have been directed toward technology primarily that will give us more operational efficiencies. In employee benefits, we are part of, the big one is health insurance. We are one of 13 communities in the Southeastern Mass Health Group, a 13-town health insurance joint purchase group. Our book of business is about $75 million a year or so. We hire consultants, Group Benefit Strategies, in fact, from Auburn, helps us manage the group. And we look at, among other things, we look at GIC, we compare ourselves to them every year. And I got to tell you, we're one of 7 health insurance joint purchase groups across the state. I do wish that people would take a more serious look at what we do. We have actually better plans in the State Group Insurance Commission for comparable prices. That is a significant advantage. The state government would love us to come into the state GIC, probably to exercise more control over cities and towns. But we are, we do that on a joint purchasing basis. Also locally, we've rolled back over a 3-year period our contribution from 90% to 75% health insurance contributions for our employees. And 4 years ago, effected some plan benefit changes, particularly in the area of copays. That line is highlighted right now because we don't have our renewal quotes for next year. But 1% of $6.3 million is $63,000. So that's a big question out there. In the miscellaneous category, we do have professionals also who advise us. Those costs have been remarkably stable. The gasoline portion, hasn't again. We do things on a group purchasing basis there. We have 2 cities and in 11 other towns with us in a joint purchasing group in southeastern Massachusetts. And we purchase between $900,000 and $1.3 million of goods and services through that particular group. So the gasoline purchases go through the miscellaneous budget. We budget high, keep our fingers crossed that those costs come in low. So again, repetition brings facility. We pound away this fixed and shared expense business so that the public, gets some sense again of our competency and our commitment to reducing, to contain these particular costs. So then comes, back on the control sheet after you see fixed and shared expenses. Now that's a hot number. That's a hot number that's subject to change because of health insurance. We're trying to stay in single digits on our health insurance change. And so for the purposes of this exercise, you'll see that in that fiscal 12 column, our estimated operating revenue, there are certain costs that are not subject to appropriation that come off the top really. And in the interest of time, I decided not to talk about it, especially the hot button issue of charter schools in that line. Fixed and shared expenses at $10.3 million roughly, yet to be adjusted. We have 2 other school systems outside of Norton that have to be taken care of. So for the purposes of this exercise, locally, you see the remaining general government departments could expect a share of approximately $10 million if they were level funded. In the schools, 22.1. That approximates that 70-30 share number. So we're at this early stage of the game with 0 wage adjustments and no consideration of health insurance increases. We're looking at a plus of about $610,000. By the time you get through with health insurance and even a 0% wage increase, which is exactly what we're pitching to the labor unions this time around, that 610 probably turns into a deficit number. Now, in general government terms and school terms, level funding does not equate to level services. Okay, so there are a number of, decisions that that have to be made. So where do we use the scissors? The last page gives some suggestions. Refinance debt, Debt financing of capital investments. Okay, I talked about those two things. Particular emphasis on technology in our financing of capital investments. More borrowing than we're accustomed to. We have a very, very, very low debt burden in Norton, and our per capita debt is among the lowest in the state. And look, money's cheap right now, and construction services are cheap. You know, products are priced right. So at this point in time, we really can't afford not, you know, to continue our capital program and keep investing in certain of these goods and services. Contain fixed costs. We talked about those fixed cost categories. Renegotiate or adjust vendor services. The state procurement law, you know, says that we can go 3 to 5 years on our contracts that are bid under state statute, Chapter 30B. If you go 5, you have to declare at the outset that that this could be a, you know, this could be a 5-year bid versus the customary 3. We've had some cases where we've actually been able to blend and extend. You know, as people were coming up, you know, at the end of the 3rd year of their particular contracts, we've either gotten them to, you know, to hold their prices or reduce their prices to us in return for extending, you know, the contract period out for another couple of years. That gives them some assurances, and it minimizes their risk from, you know, from a rebid that that might knock them out of the ballgame. Joint purchasing, I talked about. There is a, you know, Roberta was spearheading the Moore group here, and I was participating in the Central Mass area for some time, trying to get that thing up and running. And when I went down to southeastern Massachusetts, I found that, oh my goodness, this is, you know, this is wonderful. The health insurance joint purchase group that we talked about, and the other municipal joint purchase group that buys everything from bituminous concrete to office supplies to chemicals for our, you know, for our water treatment. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. It saves us from a lot of tasking and really enables us to manage instead of task. You have no idea, you know, the effort that it takes to put bids together in the municipal bid process. But the cost of our participation in that particular joint purchase group is less than $5,000 a year. I mean, it's, you know, it's remarkable. It really is. And again, it helps us, it gives us time to manage instead of task. Regionalizing services. We've got numerous examples of that already. The most recent regionalization we did came with a great deal of controversy, I have to say. We regionalized veteran services. You know, this is before the Lieutenant Governor's group published their report on regionalization, and included a section of that report on veteran services. Funny thing out there. There's a requirement that if your town's population is more than 13,000, you have to have a full-time veterans agent in Massachusetts, or share one with an adjoining community. We wanted to regionalize inside. We wanted to make our human services director the veterans agent of the town. He was a Vietnam combat vet, and we thought synergistically it would work, particularly since you'd be amazed at the overlapping caseloads. You know, the clients of our human services department are, you know, almost always the client, you know, a client of the veterans agent as well. So we saw some synergies there, which the state government, you know, told us we couldn't do. We can regionalize outside, but we cannot regionalize inside. So now we had to deal with the border issue. I had 2 towns in southeastern Mass that did not abut Norton at the time, and so we couldn't do that, even in this electronic age. We couldn't do that, and I understand the rule changes in the offing, but eventually we did regionalize with the town of Easton that does abut Norton, and Easton and Norton want more of want more of this stuff. Okay, and so we're regionalizing other services. Reduce staffing, we've talked about containing wage rates and reducing services. That's the last option. Get value for every single dollar that you can. Try and maintain the level of services that you can, but the last resort is really to cut there. So, there are operational efficiencies that we seek in good times and bad. Most of these things aren't new to us at all, but again, I just wanted to give you an idea of the process and the culture, and let everyone else talk about the macro issues. So, thank you very much, and thank you for bearing with me.
You have been a very patient audience, and I want to thank you on behalf of the speakers. I think you'll agree this was a clinic. I know we've gone a little late. Roberta is probably going to slap my moderator hand, but I thought we had 3 great speakers, and I wanted to give them a chance to tell their story. I know the secretary may have some scheduling issues, and I'm sure the manager has a fire to put out somewhere. But if there are questions, we have folks, and I want to say to the panel, if you have to duck out, we understand. But if there are questions, I'm sure they can take them from the table. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Gonzalez. The actuarial value of unfunded liabilities is calculated in the state at 8%. Yet most economists would say that that interest rate is simply too high. So is there any chance that the state would come down on the interest rate that is used to calculate the value of those unfunded liabilities?
It's a great question, and just to explain a little bit so people understand what the question is, we put money aside in our pension fund to pay pension benefits for employees that have accrued, so that when they retire, we have the money put aside to pay them. The state treasurer, there's a state entity called the Pension Reserve Investment Management Board that invests that money. And when we calculate whether we think we have enough put aside to fully fund our benefits going forward, we make assumptions about how much that board is going to earn on that fund based on the investments they make. And statutorily, they're actually directed to try to hit a target of 8.25%. And so they invest pretty aggressively. Our unfunded liability, when we calculate do we have enough in there, our unfunded liability is $20 billion, we're $20 billion short, and that's based on this actuarial calculation that assumes that what we have in there makes 8.25% over time. The question is, should we be assuming 8.25%? If we were to assume something more like 4 or 4.5%, which is what some economists say we should be assuming to be more conservative, that unfunded liability would go from 20 billion to something much higher than that, because we wouldn't be earning as much in the fund. The fact is, so we have looked at this question very seriously. The fact is that the pension fund, over its history, over decades, has actually earned more than the target on average each year, more than the 8.25%. In recent years, during this fiscal downturn, it hasn't come close to that, and that has, during this recent time, as we've had to recalculate our unfunded liability, it's actually increased our liability. You know, there are different schools of thought on this. I think ideally we would go to a lower interest rate assumption and have the fund invested in safer investments that aren't yielding as much. At the same time, we have a $20 billion hole even when we're trying to invest at 8.25. So for us to scale back right now, I think just creates a bigger problem for us. The history has shown that we've been able to hit the 8.25 target. And so for right now, we are staying. We've decided to stay with that target, but it is something we're going to continue to work with the Treasurer's Office and the Prim Board to look at, and to the extent we can make some progress in funding the system, we will be looking at whether or not we should be putting the money in safer investments and bringing down that assumption.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for Mike. Although it's true buying construction services, it's a good time to do it, you'll get a good buy. Given the problems we have on the revenue side, is this the coming year the year to put so much money into building and construction at the school level? And not in a way of retribution, but in a way of common sense, especially in recognition of how much money the school side has gotten because of the federal government and the negotiations and the healthcare costs and all those things, where we might not see as much shared sacrifice as we've seen on the municipal side.
I guess I'd start out this way. As a community, we're all in this together. Public education's an indicator of our long-term positive prognosis. So we've got to make strategic investments, particularly in physical plant. We got some of our school buildings that are 150 years old. So we've got to make strategic investments where required and do it per a 5-point financial plan. So only borrow what you know you can pay back. We made decisions prior to my role as city manager to borrow lots of money to make strategic investments in the library, the senior center, the Norbeck School, and other school projects, including Forest Grove, as well as the Vogue School. No plan to deal with the mortgage when that came up. What we're doing now is making sure that when we have these borrowings, that we identify the funding sources, we look at the long term, and make sure those dollars are there to pay it back. We have to reinvest in ourselves. We're no different than a homeowner that's got to repaint the home or put a new roof on a house to keep up the value. We got to invest in our classrooms, invest in keeping those buildings safe and learning environments. And just be reassured that when we say we're going to put $20 million into our public schools, we're doing it in a fashion that is the same way you do it at home, making sure that you got the revenue stream, even anticipating downturns, to know that you can pay that. But I think it's critical that we continue to see public education thrive, give our students a safe learning environment, make sure that we're keeping pace with technology and other aspects of what the 21st century dictates. And we have to stay away from, even though it's easy to look at when you look at the charts and see school funding going up dramatically, a continued focus on the Commonwealth on education, and you look at our funding going down and services being cut. We're one community. Us versus them doesn't work, whether it's us in the schools, us in the collective bargaining units, us and whoever. We got to figure this out together, get across the finish line.
Yes, David.
My question's for Mike, too. Mike, those 150 city jobs you were talking about, are those definite layoffs or possible layoffs?
150 is a real number, right? It's roughly about $50,000 per position if you want to get to $7 million of savings. Likely it'll be layoffs. There are some vacancies that I would include as part of that, but the vast majority would be layoffs. And they'd be identified to the departments I showed, because the vast majority of dollars that we've tried to ensure continue to flow are in public safety and in public works. The smaller departments have seen a disproportionate set of the cuts. So even though those are early projections, the budget's not finished, you'd see a heavy hit in police, you'd see a heavy hit in fire and public works as well. And the smaller departments will certainly feel the cuts, but there's not much there. And these are backbone departments like finance, technology, and inspectional services, housing and services, and the like.
So these cuts aren't dependent on negotiations elsewhere. These are cut.
No, I apologize if I wasn't clear. I presented alternatives, meaning if we can get to some healthcare reform internally with just negotiations or externally with law that gets passed the Commonwealth, we can avoid that $4 to $6 million. And if you look at those types of structural fixes, when you look long term, they'll continue to pay dividends. So I believe that with that type of structural fix, I can bridge this $7 million problem in the short term, and then look at if there's a gap, I could use some one-time money this fiscal year or next fiscal year for 12. And then long term, there'd be enough savings there that I could use one-time money in the short term to know that the recurring revenue would be there to support those positions going forward. So it's the right fix. The layoffs are a last resort, as I described, and I think counterproductive and counterintuitive.
Jim, you wanted to?
Yeah, if I can add to that, the general government priorities in Norton have been for the past several years public safety, education, public health, and public works. And as we've been through these, these cuts or attritional changes, other functions have really suffered for that. Our library, if anyone looks at the local aid numbers versus what I put on the control sheet, you'll see a gap there. You know what that's for? That means that our library was decertified 2 years ago because we're not meeting the so-called minimum funding requirements there. Our senior services outwardly seem to be curtailed. I reduced the Council on Aging budget fairly dramatically, put most of those dollars back into our health department. Our public health nurses provides much more services to the senior population than others do. Our recreation program has been all but eliminated. I mean, a number of things have happened in the name of those budget priorities that we've had. But like the manager says, we are on that verge right now without any relief from this, with this health, insurance, and wage confrontations that we'll be having right now. If there's no relief there, we really are at a point where we're going to be compromising, our public safety and public health services in Norton. We really are at that break point right now.
Because I'm very coachable, I'm going to let Roberta ask the last question.
Mike, how realistic is it to be able to negotiate on the health insurance with the departments that are under your jurisdiction, given that the Worcester Public Schools is having negotiated, the school committee is having trouble negotiating the increase in the health insurance for the teachers, and the teachers are demanding an 8.5% increase over 3 years in order for them to pay 25%. If that happens, what are the prospects of your being able to negotiate anything with the other departments?
I started out by saying I'm an eternal optimist, and I remain that way. I'm programmed that way, and sleep come heal me, because every night, even though I'm discouraged at the end of the day, the next morning I'm right back at the ranch trying to take these issues on. I'll tell you that it's going to be a difficult issue. The changes of taking on 25% of the contribution rate, as well as those adjusted co-pays, have already been done by the city-side unions. There's only one union left. 2.5 years ago, they took on those changes during the depth of the fiscal crisis. And they have taken zeros as well. And so when you look at some of the demands of the teachers union and so how they might structure some of those wage demands, and taking on 2.5 years later some of these healthcare changes, you could see a flavor of what has been historic, but we've got away from, of this Me Too, right? Wait a second, they just got that? Mr. Manager, we want what they got. And so there's a problem here that, if not done in a coordinated way, in a thoughtful way that recognizes what we can and can't afford. If the schools are facing an $8 million deficit, how can you structure 8.5% wages? The money's not there. You're actually contributing to a greater deficit and ignoring the structural problems that mean 2 years out, you're even in a deeper problem. 3 years out, you've got a bigger problem. So I'll tell you that there could be some short-term challenges of convincing in a negotiated way, good faith bargaining across the table from the 11 city unions to try to get to these additional copay changes and the GIC-esque opportunities if the school unions have not settled. That's real. But I will tell you that there's a respect that I have for those e-boards, those unions on the city side. I hope it's mutual. At times it gets strained because they recognize my goals are fiscal stability, my goals are job stability for their union members, as well as for the community as a whole. So I think anything's possible, but it definitely presents an obstacle, particularly if they can't get somewhere soon, and the schools can't get to a point where they're offering comparable wages that the city settled for the same benefits that the city employees now have to participate in from a cost perspective. It's certainly going to be one of the more challenging issues over the next 3 to 4 months as we look at these things holistically.
We began with a novena. If I don't have you out of here by 10 o'clock, there will be no redemption. So I'm going to give Roberta the last question, the manager the last word. Thanks to the 3 panelists for excellent presentations. And yes. And thanks to Commerce Bank and Bowditch and Dewey for sponsoring the event.